In the late afternoon of April 27, 1993, Bob Moran sat in his law office, located near the city courthouse in Washington, D.C., and stared out his window at the new Olson's bookstore across the street. There were books in there he'd wanted to read for years, but couldn't find the spare hours. Moran had been up most of the night, assisting lawyers in Austin on an emergency petition for a stay of execution on behalf of a Texas inmate scheduled to die by lethal injection. For weeks, he'd been immersed in preparing to defend a man at trial facing a possible death sentence in Maryland. He'd also been assisting lawyers in Georgia and South Carolina on numerous post-conviction strategies in capital cases in those states. And he'd been preparing pleadings opposing the federal government's first attempt to apply a new death penalty law in a military tribunal. That April afternoon, Moran had just returned from a meeting with the federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice. His khaki suit was creased, his tie undone. He wanted to change into the blue jeans, pullover shirt, and sandals that he usually wore in the office, and that lay in a heap on the floor. But he felt too tired to move. Moran looked over a desk piled high with files. His gaze stopped on the dream catcher tacked to his office door. It was an authentic Navajo relic, presented to him by a grateful client. Raised a Boston Catholic, he preferred the simple Native American spirituality to any institutional religion. He studied the dream catcher on his door and made a wish for the one client whose image he couldn't shake, the one client who was haunting his thoughts. He took a deep breath, looked up a number on his Rolodex, picked up the phone, and dialed long distance. At 40 years old, Bob Moran had devoted most of his legal career to assisting people facing the death penalty. By age 30, he had walked away from both a lucrative position in private practice and a promising academic career at Georgetown University to join the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta in an effort to fight the swelling tide of death sentences being imposed and carried out in 9 southern states. From there, he'd gone on to become a public defender in Maryland, specializing in death penalty cases. And then in the nation's capital, he formed a small law firm dedicated to helping death row inmates. Moran had long believed that the way the death penalty was being imposed in the United States was unjust. Now, having spent years battling executions in state after state, he'd become certain of something else: that there were inmates facing execution or serving life terms in prison who were innocent. One such person, in whose innocence Moran had come to believe strongly, was Kirk Bloodsworth. Kirk Noble Bloodsworth had been sentenced to die in Maryland's gas chamber for the 1984 rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl. After being granted a new trial by a Maryland appellate court, Bloodsworth had been convicted a second time. His appeals to the higher courts in Maryland had all been exhausted. In February 1989, Moran had received a call from Gary Christopher in the State Public Defender's Office, asking him to meet with Bloodsworth. "Every lawyer who's touched this case believes the kid is innocent," Christopher had said. Moran had been reluctant. He knew that Bloodsworth's sentence after his second trial had been changed from death to 2 consecutive life terms. Moran was swamped with death penalty cases and felt like a triage doctor at a disaster site. He had so many clients scheduled for execution that he couldn't afford to spend time trying to help one facing only a double life sentence. But when Christopher called a second time, Moran, as a favor to a colleague, agreed to visit this kid Bloodsworth. He had no intention, though, of becoming his lawyer. A month later, in late March, Moran and his partner, David Kagan-Kahns, had driven to the Maryland Penitentiary to meet with another client. They figured they'd briefly interview Bloodsworth while at the prison. The plan was to hear the man out Then politely tell